Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the second of our 2024 IFWO winter webinars. This evening's presentation, Indiana Reptiles and Amphibians. Since 1977, IFWO has been a forum for private land forest landowners to learn more about how to manage their woodland properties. With the advice of foresters, wildlife biologists, soil scientists, and other natural resources professionals, we're here to enable private landowners to maximize their woodland properties and to meet their woodland management goals. I invite you to look at our webpage, www.ifwo.org, to look at the many different educational opportunities that we offer throughout the year. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director, Liz Jackson, to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thank you, Lee. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you join us tonight, and I'm excited to hear about this topic. It's not one I know much about, so I know I'm going to get a lot out of it. If you would keep your video off during the presentation to limit distractions, you're welcome to turn it on during the Q&A. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box at any time. I'll moderate those at the end. This presentation will be recorded, and we will announce in a few weeks when it's available after we've had it edited and closed captioned. We're pleased to have joining us tonight Brian MacGowan. Brian has been an extension wildlife specialist with the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University since 1999. His most recent research and educational programs focus on forest management, human-wildlife conflicts, and wildlife habitat management. He's a certified wildlife biologist and a member of the Wildlife Society, the professional organization of wildlife biologists. Thanks, Brian, for coming on today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
All right, thanks, Liz. I'm not used to such a fancy introduction, but I'll take it. You're dating me a little bit with that 1999 reference there, but that's all right. So good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to be here. So I'm happy to really talk about reptiles and amphibians. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, and it's a really interesting group of wildlife because it's one of the few groups that you can really as a landowner or a wildlife enthusiast, really get out there and explore and find all these animals and really view them close up. And so that's really an unusual thing. Certainly some of the mammals we can observe, birds, you can hear calls and things like that and see them. But this, for the most part, is a really unique group from that regard. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we'll get started. So what I want to do is just very, very briefly just talk a little bit about amphibians and reptiles in general. Most of the time I'm going to spend talking about different, go by the groups of species and pick out some species that I think are interesting and talk a little bit about facts and habitat use of those. And then I'll close with talking about, from a management standpoint, what some of the things we can do to benefit some of these species. So it's kind of funny because amphibians and reptiles get grouped together a lot, but they're very, very different in a lot of their requirements in general, right? And so amphibians are really, really important. So there's been several studies looking at salamanders and how abundant they are. And so one of the a couple studies from the Northeast United States, they surveyed the forest and they weighed all the animals, and really even though salamanders are very, very small relative to most of these other species, the biomass of them equals or exceeds that of a lot of the other vertebrate groups. And so it's kind of interesting from that standpoint. And certainly they have a role in that food chain. You know, one of the things, if you think about it, is in a forested system, you've got all this stuff underneath the ground, right? You've got a lot of invertebrates and things like that. And a lot of these animals spend that time under the ground, the salamanders, and they consume those. But then they're prey for the stuff that's above ground. So they've been called kind of an energy conveyor belt to a certain extent in these systems. A lot of them are bioindicators. And so salamanders and amphibians in general, they have moist skin and they absorb things through their skin, right? And so because of that, they could be sensitive to certain pollutants and other things. And so if you've got healthy, diverse amphibian populations in a system, that's a good indicator that things are really well from an ecosystem standpoint. And the other thing about these is most of them, but not all of them, are tied to wetlands or breeding pools and wet areas, right? And so I'll kind of talk about that to some extent, and certainly some exceptions to that rule. You know, when we're in grade school, we're always taught like amphibians, you know, lay their eggs in water, they hatch the larva, and the larva metamorphose into adults, and they leave the wetland, you know, that kind of thing. And for most of the species, that's certainly true, but not for all of them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as the night goes on. And then of course you have reptiles, and again, you know, predator-prey dynamics. That's certainly important. You know, reptiles and amphibians, being that they don't create their own body heat, most of the energy that they consume goes to body weight. And so some of these animals can grow rapidly in a very short amount of time because they're not wasting all that, I should say waste, but they're not using all that energy to warm themselves, right? And so because of that, they're very efficient energy transfers in those systems. Again, nothing that we think about on a day-to-day basis, but certainly, you know, we can kind of think back on that and understand that that's got value, right? Many are really tied to overwintering and breeding sites. And so that's another similar aspect with amphibians and reptiles, is that they don't really move large distances, right? And so if you don't have the habitat, they're not going to do very well. And so, and a lot of times, and specifically with reptiles, it's tied to a very specific breeding site, and so or overwintering site. And so if you don't have those, you're going to have some issues there from a population standpoint. And then because of that dispersal inability, they're really vulnerable to habitat changes. And so when you look at a lot of the wildlife research, and particularly with forest research, you know, historically, and I say that within the last, you know, 40 years or so, a lot of it is very bird focused. And birds make a really good study animal because if you change the habitat, the vegetative structure, they're going to respond because they can move large distances. And so they seek those areas out, and you'll get them responding accordingly. With most of these species, if they're not close by, you know, they're not going to find it, right? And so if their core habitat is really impacted, it's going to be really problematic for them. And so that's kind of some things to kind of think about when you think about these things. All right, so the first group I'm going to talk about are salamanders. And so salamanders have glandular skin, smooth skin. They don't have claws like lizards do. You know, if you just have a lizard and a salamander in your hands, they kind of look similar shaped bodies, you know, those kinds of things. But claws is certainly one difference among them. The tails are often laterally flattened, and so it's like kind of like a fish tail, because a lot of these animals spend a lot of time in water, and so that helps propel them in that aspect. They all lay eggs, and so fertilization is internal usually, but not always. So there's no copulation. So in other words, the males kind of deposit sperm, the females lay egg, and then what happens sometimes is that the females then, depending on the species, I misspoke, sorry. Let me rephrase that. So what happens is the females take that sperm internally, the eggs are fertilized, and then they lay their eggs, if that makes sense. And so it depends on the species. Not all of them do that. Hellbenders are exception to that, where they're more like fish, where the female lays the eggs, the males come over to deposit the sperm over the eggs, and then the eggs are fertilized, you know, that kind of a thing. But again, in all of these species, there's no copulation. And then the size really is quite different. The giant Pacific, you know, Asian salamanders are almost 5 feet in length. Our largest salamander in Indiana would be the hellbender, and it's about a foot to foot and a half, depending on the age of the animal. So some species. So one of them is the eastern newt, and so this is really kind of a different species. It's really aquatic. And so as an adult, it spends all its life in wetlands. So it doesn't kind of hang on land, although there is an exception to that. And so they have these spots on their back. Their belly has like dark spots. But what's interesting about newts is that they have a fourth life stage. And so I mentioned that life stage where it goes from egg to larva to adult. what happens with newts is that they can go from egg to larva to this red F terrestrial stage, which is an adult, or they can go from the egg to the larva to the aquatic adult stage. And then if the wetland dries up, they'll transform into this red F stage. And so these look more like reptiles, where they've got kind of bumpy skin, dry, rough skin, but they're completely terrestrial. And so they hang out in woods and things like that. And what's interesting about them is they're red. And so usually red things stand out. And so predators see that and they want to consume them. But kind of like what you've heard about perhaps with like poison dart frogs and some of those things, that they're red and because it's a warning sign to predators, and that they're not good to eat. And so they have a lot of this toxin in them, and it really makes them unpalatable or even poisonous to some predators who would want to consume them. So kind of a really oddity in the salamander world. So you've got different groups of salamanders. And so one of the largest groups that we have in Indiana are the lungless salamanders, or plethodontids. And so lungless salamanders are all quite small, and they get their name because they don't have lungs. And so they respire slowly, only through their skin. And so they have that oxygen exchange from their skin to the air from that standpoint. So it's really, really unique in regarding that. But for the most part, there's kind of two major groups. There's one groups that are completely terrestrial, that they don't use water at all. And then there's another group called brook salamanders that spend a lot of time in the water, almost exclusively. And so, but they look very similar. And so they all kind of have this small, similar body shape from that standpoint. They all don't really move very far distances. There's no annual migrations. Where they kind of live, they live their whole life, and that's kind of how it goes from that standpoint. So a lot of these species that we'll find, it's really difficult to determine sex except during certain parts of the year. And so with plethodontids, the only time to really determine sex externally is during the breeding season. So during the breeding season, which is really coming up upon us for a lot of these species, the males have these cirri. And let me see if I can get my laser pointer out. And so these are not too prominent. Sometimes they're much more prominent than this. They almost look like two fangs coming down, or they have what's called a mental gland. And so salamanders communicate, like males and females communicate a lot through chemical cues. And so during breeding, there'll be courtship routines with different species, and they vary among the species. But a lot of times what happens is that like the chemicals during the breeding season will kind of wick up this groove into the nasal cavity there, and then they can able to assess, breeding condition and all that kind of stuff. And so it's kind of interesting from that standpoint. It's really, really unique. You think like most of these things would just kind of be hanging out doing stuff, but some of their breeding courtships are actually quite, I wouldn't say complicated, but detailed, if you can say that. So one of our most common species is the eastern redback salamander. So this is a terrestrial species found in woodlands. There's two color phases, and this was taken with flash photography. So a lot of times the red stripe isn't quite so bold as it is on this picture, but there's that redback phase and the leadback phase. So the same species, just different color morphs, right? And so these nest completely underground, and they lay their eggs in underground or in rotting logs, that kind of a thing. And there's enough moisture in those areas so those eggs don't desiccate. And so what happens, you're probably thinking like, well, Brian, the amphibian life stage is going from egg to larva to adult. What actually happens is it's direct development. So they'll go through that larval stage, but it's within the egg. So when the egg hatches, they're like miniature versions of the adult, and then they grow bigger throughout their lives. And so they can kind of skip that aquatic stage. And so that's why they're found throughout all different woodlands throughout most of Indiana. And there's been some studies to really show that these are really, really common, and that you can have up to about 12,000 or so per acre if you think about it from that standpoint. So that's a lot of little animals running around out there. Again, most of the time you're not going to see these things unless you're getting into leaf litter, you're turning over rocks and logs and things like that during certain times of the year. So when it's really, really cold or really, really dry, you're not going to find these species. They're down deeper, kind of hanging out. But once you get warm moisture, they're going to go to the surface. At night, they're going to go about and feed quite readily. And so that's kind of like the lifespan of these animals. All right, so I'm going to try something new. So this gives you kind of a hopefully, oh boy, if I take my laser pointer off, can it? There we go. So this gives you an idea of the size. So this is a little one. That's not a full-grown adult. That's a full-grown adult. So it gives you the kind of estimate of the time frame. And that was actually up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan during one of our summer practicum courses where we do different amphibian and reptile sampling, just to kind of give you a feel for the size of those animals. Yeah. Oh boy. Okay, let's try that. All right, there we go. Technology. So this is a slimy salamander. So it's kind of unique because when it's caught, it emits a sticky substance and it's distasteful. So it's kind of a defense mechanism, right? So the other thing that some of these animals can do is they can drop their tail. So basically, that tail would look a lot different. Whoopsie, sorry about that. Because it regenerates. And so, but this one's really unique. It's actually the largest plethodon. It can get quite big, 20 centimeters, which is pretty large for these animals. And so just kind of a unique species found throughout the central to southern Indiana and woodlands from that standpoint. One of the brook salamanders, this is a southern two-line salamander. And so this is one that has an aquatic larval stage. So it's in the same family, but it's different in that regards. So the larvae have these external gills. They almost look like mud puppies, but they're really, really small. And they just hang out and they'll metamorphose in the water into the adult stage from that standpoint. And this is really typical habitat for these things. Again, in these water areas under rocks and things. So if I was looking for southern two-line salamanders, I would flip over rocks and those kind of in these habitats. And in those habitats, you would probably find things like queen snakes or northern water snakes. And so there'd be some other things in there, obviously. But this would be kind of a classic two-line salamander habitat. So the other big family of salamanders are the mole salamanders. And so these are ones that spend most of their lives underground. When you get the spring rains with warmer temperatures, they have these migrations to breeding ponds where they reproduce. And after that, they'll kind of head back to the terrestrial habitat. And that's pretty much all they do from that standpoint. So this is one that has 4 species. And so in these breeding ponds, you'll have different species together in these breeding ponds. And so that's an eastern tiger salamander, a marbled salamander, a smallmouth salamander, and then the little one there is the mole salamander. And so the mole salamander is actually a species, although the family name is mole salamanders. Don't get me started on that. I didn't come up with it. I'm just telling you how it is, right? And so this gives you an idea of kind of the size of these. So again, much larger than the ones we had before. So this is actually a blue spotted salamander. So this one is actually found only in northern Indiana, and you go up into Michigan and Wisconsin, and you'll find them up there. But again, quite larger, and that's pretty good size representation of most of these species within this family group. So with these, water is really, really important. And so with a lot of the plethodon, it's not so much, okay, except for the brook salamanders, but with these, it definitely is. And so these temporary wetlands are really, really important. They're fishless, they have structure in them. And so what happens is for almost all the species during the spring, they'll migrate to these and breed. And so what happens is it's a combination of temperature and rainfall. And so this is some data that a colleague of mine, Rod Williams, collected from the Purdue wildlife area. And so the green are males and the yellow are females in terms of the bar. The red are temperatures and the blue is precipitation. So you kind of need both of these up to a certain level in order to really initiate that big migration movement from that standpoint. And so what happens in these wetlands is the males deposit these spermatophores all throughout the wetlands. And sometimes they'll stack them up on each other trying to beat, because the top spermatophore wins, if you can think of it that way. The female walks around, and she'll pick up the spermatophore with her cloaca. The eggs are fertilized, and then she'll lay egg masses. And so the egg masses differ from species. These are smallmouth salamander egg masses. Some of them have more eggs, some have less. But what happens after they lay them, they kind of absorb some of the water in the surrounding habitat, and they swell up like that until they kind of equalize, if you think of the pressure from that standpoint. And then these will develop over time. Depends on the weather, right? So if you have really warm weather, sometimes these can develop within 2 or 3 weeks and hatch. And other times it might be a couple months, right? So it just kind of depends on what's going on in that situation. So just like with the Plethodon salamanders, mole salamanders, you can only differentiate sex during the breeding season. The males will have a swollen cloaca, and so the females won't have that kind of bulge right there. So that's a male characteristic in these species. A unique one of these groups is the marbled salamander. So they're kind of interesting because what they do is they do the opposite, and they actually breed in the fall. And so the idea there, it's kind of a risky venture. And so they'll breed in the fall, they'll lay their eggs in a wetland area, but basically the wetland is not full, or sometimes not full. And so what happens, they might be under a rock or something like that. The eggs are still moist. And the idea there is when you get the kind of late October, November rains that we typically get, the wetland fills, the eggs will hatch either earlier than the other ones in the spring or even at that time. And then they get a head start on the other ones because all these different species in these wetlands are competing. And so it's risky because if the wetland you don't get a lot of fall rain, they're not going to survive, right? So you need that fall rain in order for those eggs to survive. So kind of an anomaly in the salamander world, if you think of it from that standpoint. Frogs and toads are neurons, right? So they're tailless. Frogs can jump from that standpoint, but certainly toads can too. Webbed and unclawed toes. Fertilization is external in most species, and so what happens is this is an example of amplexus where the females are ready to breed. The males kind of grab on, and so once she lays the eggs, the females deposit the sperm as they're coming out of her from that standpoint. And so there's competition there. So these are actually wood frogs. One male wasn't sure what to do, so he kind of grabbed the wrong end, if you think of it from that standpoint. And this is a wood frog egg mass. And so wood frogs are actually breeding right now. So it's been warm enough. I've seen posts and things online where you get wood frogs singing in the woodlands. They're depositing their eggs. And a female wood frog can deposit thousands and thousands of eggs. It kind of makes sense from the standpoint of being such an early breeder. Maybe you have to deposit so many eggs because the conditions aren't great, but it's kind of an interesting species from that standpoint. And their breeding season is really short. This gives you an idea of kind of generally when some of these species will breed. Again, chorus frogs, spring peepers, wood frogs, those are our earlier breeders. Some of our tree frogs, toads are generally being a later breeder. But again, it really is weather dependent. In my neighborhood, I live in an urban environment, but there's some wet areas around the house. And last year we had such a warm winter. I had frogs calling in late January, believe it or not. So it's just kind of just depends on what's going on in a given year. But so these are just kind of guidelines, just to give you an idea of kind of what goes on there. So again, gray tree frog, really common frog throughout most of Indiana. It's a woodland species. These are the ones that you'll often see like on patio doors or lights on at night, things like that, trying to capture insects and things. They're really well adapted for tree life, but they're found throughout a lot of different areas. Interesting thing about them is their color is really they can change, right? So sometimes an individual might be very green, might be very gray, might be almost black. It just kind of depends on what they're trying to blend into their environment from that standpoint. But you can see as a tree frog, it has these very well-developed toe discs, so it can stick on a lot of different things. American toad, so we have a couple of different species, the American and the Fowlers. American toads are more of a woodland species. Fowlers are more tied to larger water bodies and things like that. So American toads have one or just a couple warts per spot, and they have a belly that has spots on them, right? And so that's a good way to kind of see that. Again, a close-up of you got these large warts within that dark black spot. Again, 1 or 2 warts per spot. And that's just a close-up of that belly. A Fowler's toad is the other toad. And so you have multiple warts per spot, so sometimes 4 or 5 even, and then their bellies are quite clear. And so that's a good way to differentiate those two species from that standpoint. They have different calls, obviously, but we're not going there today. And then that's a kind of a common American toad egg mass there, kind of a string of tape it's been described as from that standpoint. And American toads will breed in a variety of different kind of permanent water body sources and also temporary water bodies. All right, so that was the salamander 101 viewpoint there. So then in terms of reptiles, we have lizards, we have turtles, and we have snakes. And so in Indiana, we actually have 6 species of lizards. This is actually one of them. This is a slender glass lizard, and it gets its name because it readily will drop its tail if it feels threatened, right? And so, kind of shatters like glass. But this is a lizard because it has eyelids that blink, and it also has an external ear opening. Okay, and so those are lizard characteristics from that standpoint. So common 5-line skink is our most widely distributed lizard throughout Indiana. So there's also the race runner, which is strictly a northern species, as well as the glass lizard. All the other skinks and the fence lizard are predominantly southern Indiana species. And so this is one a lot of people see in their woodlands. You might see it around rock outcrops, down woody debris, even like landscape cabins, all that kind of stuff in the woods, right? And so adults really are about half a foot long. And what happens though is a lot of times people see these juveniles with the bright blue tail. The males, when they grow older, they lose that blue tail and they're more of just a brown striped species. During the breeding season, they'll develop kind of an orangish on their jaws, and then their jaws will widen a little bit. So that's the way you can differentiate males from females. Females will kind of have a very pale blue tail. They'll retain that, but it's not nearly as bright as the juveniles from that standpoint. And so this is a female here. This was a log or a rock, I don't recall, that was overturned. And so she had her nest of eggs in there that she's kind of just hanging out from that standpoint. So sometimes what happens with amphibians and reptiles is you'll find the female associated with the eggs. And it's always kind of a question, is this parental care, or is it just like, hey, she just got done and you just happen to find her there? And it's really unclear, but really most of these species really probably don't offer a lot of parental care. It's more of maybe it's a day or two of recovery and then she's moving on. It's not necessarily her defending the clutch of eggs there against a predator. All right, turtles. And so really from a woodland standpoint, we really only have one turtle that's a woodland turtle, the eastern box turtle, really found throughout all of Indiana. A lot of different coloration to it. Some of them have a lot of orange, yellow on their skin as well as their shell. Some of them are very, very dark and nondescript. Okay, but you can differentiate sex, and so males have an indented plastron, where females it's very flat. Okay, and then males, if you have a box turtle that has a red eye, it's always a male, and if it has a brown eye, it's almost always a female. There's a slight chance it could be a male, but in almost all cases it's a female. But again, you can always look at the plastron. And then with all turtles, you can also look at the tail. So if you extend the tail without yanking on it, but just extend the tail, if the cloacal opening extends past the edge of the shell, it's going to be a male, and if it doesn't, it's going to be a female. And that's pretty much universal across turtles. So what do turtles do is they spend a lot of time and stuff. And so years ago, I was involved in a research project on the hardwood ecosystem experiment, and we were radio tracking turtles. And we found that a lot of them like down woody debris, treetops, things like that. In the summer when it's hot and dry, they would kind of bulldoze their way down the leaf litter, and they might spend a day or two in there just kind of hanging out. Over winter, though, they spend about half their lives over winter. And so they'll bury themselves down in depressions. Usually these are things in like old stump holes or root tunnels or things like that. It's not really hard pan soil. They don't have the capacity to dig through that. So it's got to be really kind of relatively easy to do that. And so what we did in the study, one of the things, we had a graduate student, Andrea Currylow, and she had temperature sensors on the shells, and then she also had temperature sensors at different depths in these hibernation sites. And so you can kind of look at the known depth temperature and the turtles. And so during the winter, these turtles were actually kind of going up and down depending on the weather. But the average hibernation depth of these turtles was really about, it was about 10 centimeters, which is about, what, 4 inches. So they didn't hibernate very deep. And so again, these temperatures set were at close to the top of the shell. So the top of the shell was about 4 inches or so below ground level, if you think about it from that standpoint. So kind of interesting. And the other thing is they tended to go to just about the same site year after year for hibernation, which was unknown at the time. Moving on here. So from a snake standpoint, we have a lot of species of snakes. And so snakes, people ask like, well, what good are snakes, right? And so on this hardwood ecosystem experiment, we did a lot of work with rattlesnakes. And so one interesting thing about some of these venomous species is there's actually been some research done looking at properties of venom. And so venom is kind of a combination of different chemicals, and a lot of these things act very specifically on certain cellular functions. And so what happens is they can isolate these specific chemicals, they can replicate those, and so generate those in the lab, and then they can use those to act on certain things that they want. And so they've actually developed drugs to treat stroke, heart attack, and even cancer based on what they've learned from studying venom, which is kind of interesting from that standpoint. If you think about cancer treatment, chemotherapy is a common treatment that unfortunately a lot of us are familiar with. But what that does is it attacks the cancerous cells, but it also attacks the healthy cells. So it's very hard on individuals, right? So the idea behind these drugs developed from some of these studying venom is that they only attack the cancerous cells and they leave the healthy cells alone, which is really quite remarkable if you think about it. So, of course, with snakes, one of the first things people think about is, well, is it venomous or not? And so depending on what resource you look at, we have about 32 or 30 species of snakes in Indiana. And, you might think like, well, why don't we know how many exist? There's always fights about what are species and what maybe should be subspecies in the academic world. Not my fight, but others. And then some of these things are really so uncommon is that there's been some species that haven't been documented in Indiana in 40 to 50 years. And so there would be a thought to say, well, are these actually even here or not? That kind of a thing. So I'm not going to get into that, but you get the idea. But we have 4 venomous species in Indiana. We have the timber rattlesnake, eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, the cottonmouth, and then also the copperhead. And so this is a timber rattlesnake. And so all of our venomous species in Indiana are pit vipers. And so pit vipers always have this cat-like pupil, vertical pupil when there's light out. And then they also have this heat sensing pit that's below the eye and the nostril on each side of the head. Some of the publications you read, they've referenced the width of the head relative to the neck, and certainly that is true. But a lot of species of snakes, when they're threatened, they will flatten out their bodies. And so people say, well, their head's wider than the neck, so it's got to be venomous. So it's one of those things where unless you kind of are familiar with snakes, you look at them a lot, or that kind of a thing, you can be fooled pretty easily by some of those things. So venom was actually the belief was it was actually developed to from saliva, essentially, to help in eating. And so if you think about it, if you're a small snake, you're eating things like worms and ants, snails, all that kind of stuff, and you're really not too concerned about getting bit. And so most snakes, when they consume prey, they just swallow the thing whole and it's alive, right? They lack chewing teeth, and so they're doing that. But if you're a larger snake consuming larger prey, there's some risk associated with that, right? So even things like a tree squirrel or a chipmunk, they could put a pretty good bite on you. And so there's an advantage to being able to immobilize that prey before you consume it. And so the thought is that's kind of how venom was actually evolved over time from that standpoint. And so this is actually a timber rattlesnake consuming a tree squirrel there. So timber rattlesnakes, only the big ones can consume tree squirrels. Most of them eat things like chipmunks, white-footed mice, and even songbirds to some extent. So some examples of those venomous species, again, because I know that's always what people kind of seem to be interested in. So this is an eastern Massasauga. It has multiple rows of blotches along the whole body. Massasaugas are actually a very small snake. They're limited to the far northern Indiana, although there's a couple spots in other parts of northern Indiana that they've been found before. And really, it's unusual for them to get more than 2 feet long. So they're a relatively small snake, although they're kind of heavy-bodied relative to their length, if you can think of it from that standpoint. And they're really a wetland snake, so you'll find them in areas that people aren't really hanging out in from that standpoint. So this is a timber rattlesnake, eastern timber rattlesnake, and so they have these chevrons or blotches along their back. They tend to be bands towards the tail, and then the tail is black. Of course, it has the rattle on it. Don't mind the white paint on there. We when we're doing our study, we'd mark them a little bit, so visually as a researcher, we know that's a snake we've already processed, so we don't need to handle it again from that standpoint. So obviously, we don't want to handle these things more than we have to for obvious reasons. And so this is a typical kind of a yellow color phase. You also have gray color phases. And actually, if you go out east, a black color phase is actually quite common. And so our old previous herpetologist in Indiana, Zach Walker, he did his master's work on studying rattlesnakes in Brown County State Park. And this was, in the mid to late 90s. He came across one black color phase rattlesnake in the park, and that was the only one he ever encountered. And I never have either in my work with rattlesnakes. And so the yellow and the gray is all I've ever encountered. Cottonmouths, and so these are species that sometimes get mistaken with other stuff, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the things that sometimes books and things don't really teach you is how an animal presents itself. And so cottonmouths, they get that because they have this whitish, pinkish lining in their mouth, and so they'll open that mouth really wide sometimes, and it's kind of a warning sign. So hey, I'm a cottonmouth, stay away, kind of a thing. Very thick bodies. They have some banding on them, which sometimes isn't very obvious from that standpoint. Again, an aquatic state. And in Indiana, they're only found in 2 spots. That's it. So most of the time when people see what they think is a cottonmouth in the water, it's a water snake, northern water snake. In some parts, it could be other species of water snakes, but for the most part, it's probably a northern water snake or midland water snake. And then our 4th species is the northern copperhead. So this by far is our most widely distributed venomous species in Indiana. Again, the southern third of the state or so in appropriate habitat. And so it's really kind of has these hourglass blotches on them, usually has a spot on them, and they're very faintly highlighted in white, but sometimes that's not really obvious from that standpoint. Some of them are kind of tan, some of them are very reddish, bronzy color from that standpoint. But one interesting thing about this picture, this is a copperhead, but you notice it kind of has that head position similar to what I showed you with the cottonmouth. And these species are actually in the same genus, so they're closely related. Timber rattlesnakes are in a different genus. And so you kind of wonder if that's a genetic thing regarding that, but that's interesting from that standpoint. So this is another copperhead, same species, but one thing, it's kind of hard to see from this picture, but you can see the dark in that eye right there is very wide. And so this picture was actually taken at night. And so just like us, when light is low, our pupils will dilate. And so that's why I mentioned earlier with the vertical pupil, that's during the daylight. So snakes at night will widen their eyes. And so you kind of got to keep an eye on that. So again, diamond, broad-headed head, shape at rest relative to a skinnier neck. So that's a good symbol. But again, there's non-venomous snakes that I could show you that would be pretty close to that. So you have to really know what you're looking at. This is the juvenile copperhead. And so one of the tricky parts about snake identification is that juveniles can look a lot of times very, very different from adults. In fact, sometimes not even looks like the same species. And so that can be a confusing thing. The other thing is that with some species, colors are different, patterns are different. And so snake identification can kind of be a tricky thing. But you can see these hourglass shapes on this snake. You can see some of the very faint white highlights on those hourglass things. But the other thing you can see is it has a green tail. And so with both copperheads and cottonmouths, when they're juveniles, they have that different color tail. And so the thought there is that they use that to kind of wiggle, where something will think that's something to eat. And then they prey upon that. So a little mouse or something like that would look at that as something to consume. And then they're just kind of ambushed, predator waiting for it to come there, kind of a thing. And they lose that color when they're adults. So again, northern water snakes. So we have several species of water snakes, diamondback water snakes, plain-bellied water snake. Some of you may have heard of a copper-bellied water snake, which is one of the plain-bellied snakes. It's endangered in parts of Indiana, but this by far is our most common one. So you have the northern subspecies, and then you also have the midland subspecies. And so the northern subspecies has a lot more bands, and they tend to be more brown to gray. The midland subspecies has fewer bands, tends to have a lot of wider space within those darker bands, and they also tend to be more reddish brown than the tanned colors from that standpoint. This is an interesting picture right here because this shows a northern water snake. Both of those are the same species, but you can barely see some of the bands on this snake, right? And so what happens with snakes is that their skin gets old and they shed it. And so snakes will typically shed their skin 2, 3, sometimes more times during a year. Part of that depends on where in the country you are. So in Indiana, we have winters. All of our snakes hibernate. So their active season is much, much shorter. And so as their skin gets a little aged, it tends to get more uniform in color, more drab. And then that snake, once they shed their skin, it could look very much like the snake in the top picture from that standpoint. So they can look a lot different. One thing about our water snakes is they have these half moon shapes on their belly, and that's a really unique characteristic. We don't have any other snake that has that characteristic. So with a lot of the snakes, the belly is really, really helpful in terms of identifying them. Not critical, but very helpful. But most people don't want to handle stuff and look at it in that regard. Here's a picture of a midland water snake. So again, much, much fewer bands, a little bit different color. This is a relatively small individual from that standpoint. Again, compare it with a northern water snake that has a lot of bands. And so what happens with these, a good characteristic is the bands are complete towards the head. And then as you get closer to the tail, they tend to alternate almost like a diamond or a chain pattern from that standpoint. So that's another good characteristic you can look at. So a lot of times with these species, I get questions about like, well, they're in their water, what are they, that kind of a thing. And so our water snakes and other snakes, when they're swimming, usually all you see is their head sticking out of the water. For whatever reason, and the reasoning, I have no idea, but what they do is all of our pit vipers, when they swim, they tend to inflate their lungs, and a snake's lungs go throughout most of its body. And so what they do is like it's a boat sitting on water. So if you've ever observed one of these in real life, even from a distance, you can see almost the whole body. It's really, really quite telling. And so it's a really good feature to tell, is it a viper or is it a cottonmouth or some other species? Because those are very two different pictures from that standpoint. Really, really good field indicator. Another snake I'll mention is the milk snake. Milk snakes are one of those because they're kind of brightly colored. They got a lot of blotches on them. They tend to get confused with a lot of our venomous species or things that people might be worried about, but they're really quite harmless. They eat a lot of mice and things like that, so they're good to have around. And they have some different color patterns. And so some of them are quite red, some of them are quite drab in color, but regardless, the belly is always kind of this white and black checkerboard pattern from that standpoint. So they're not a terribly big snake. You're talking about maybe 2.5 feet, the biggest one you can find. pardon me, from that standpoint. But they get their name because they used to be found in barns and things like that that had cows, and so people thought that they were in there sucking milk out of the cows, that kind of a thing. But that's obviously not true. They're a predator like all snakes, and so they eat a lot of stuff that we don't want around. Most widely distributed snake we have in North America goes up to Canada, all the way down through Mexico, throughout most of the United States. Different subspecies, but you get the idea. A racer is another common species, and so racers are found in really a variety of habitats. Sometimes you'll find them in very open habitats. Sometimes you'll find them in really solid woodlands, open woodlands, but you get the idea. But this is a really good indication of the difference between some of the juvenile species of juveniles of some of these species versus adults. So this is a juvenile racer. So a couple features to look at. So it's got these blotches along the back, which is a kind of common feature among a lot of snakes, right? But you actually have 3 rows of dots along each side. And so numerous blotches, 3 rows of dots on each side, really big eye relative to the head, right? So racers are active pursuing their prey. Green snakes do this too. So they have big eyes compared to their body because they see very well. And so that's a really good indication. Racers also come in a couple different color morphs. You have like the blue racer, which is almost like a gray to green turquoise racer. You can think of it that way. Then you also have the southern black racer, which kind of has a bluish tone, but sometimes it can be quite black. This one tends to be blue. This one is actually a recent emergence in the spring from hibernating. So the skin looks very dull. It's dirty, just came from underground. Usually what happens with snakes when they emerge from hibernation, within about a couple weeks or so, certainly, they will shed their skin and then they'll be off moving around looking for something to eat, that kind of a thing. And they'll look, again, much different. But again, no coloration there from that standpoint. Good sized eye, a white chin, but again, very smooth, shiny scales from that standpoint. Racers often get confused with rat snakes. And so depending on what publication you're looking at, they might refer it as the gray rat snake. They might refer it as a black rat snake. It's all the same species, not my fight, but that's just kind of how it is. So again, they look kind of similar to a racer, right? If you just look at it from that standpoint. But one thing you'll see is you'll get like a lot of borders on these scales, like dark bars. You'll get blotches on the skin, so it's not a kind of a regular kind of a dark pattern. It's got kind of some markings on it, and then a lot of these will be brown to gray to black and those kinds of things. The other thing about both racers and rat snakes is you can look at how they present themselves, right? So a lot of times rat snakes, when they're crossing or just kind of hanging out, this one's kind of in a defense posture here, they have a very ribbony appearance to them, right? With racers, a lot of times they tend to loop their body all over themselves. This is a really common presentation of racers. So sometimes that's a good kind of a field indicator if you don't want to get too close and check them out. Again, both of them non-venomous. They eat a lot of things that we don't want around, that kind of thing. But this is one of our longer snakes from that standpoint, no doubt about it. The thing about rat snakes, although a lot of snakes can climb, even timber rattlesnakes can climb up into trees, they spend a lot of time up in trees. And so they're again, foraging, looking for food, that kind of a thing. Probably, if you think about it, it could be a good resting site away from predators from that standpoint. And so you'll see them a lot of times in trees and there. This one's a good a different looking specimen. Again, very strong blotches. I would presume that this one recently shed its skin, and so the pattern is really strong. As that skin kind of ages a little bit, that pattern is probably going to reduce a little bit, not become quite so conspicuous. Another interesting snake, you can see I'm partial to snakes, sorry. I just find them very interesting, snakes and salamanders. But hognose snake, so eastern hognose snake. And this is, again, one of those species of snakes that's really unique. It has a couple very different color phases, right? One that's kind of gray, very solid, bland. One that can have a lot of different colors, reds, blues, greens, very blotchy. But one thing is they both have is that upturned snout that's relatively short. They have very stocky bodies, and they all pretty much, most of their diet is toads. That's almost all that they consume. And so they're actually a rare fan fang snakes. They have fangs in the very, very back of their mouths. So if they would bite you, those fangs couldn't penetrate your skin because they couldn't open their mouth enough. You'd have to kind of really get back down in there. But one of the neat things about hognose snakes is that they'll go through a thing when threatened where they'll hiss, put up a big display and that kind of thing. And if that doesn't work, they'll play dead. And they actually secrete a chemical from their anal gland that smells like a dead animal. And so they'll spend minutes like this, just kind of hanging out. A lot of things won't consume something that they didn't kill, and so they don't want anything to do with it. And then they'll kind of wake up a little bit, look around. If the coast is clear, they'll take off. And so kind of interesting. But again, this belly is really, really descriptive of a hognose snake. Almost has a concave shape to it, but it's perfectly clear. There's no spots or blotches on that. Certainly garter snakes, we all are familiar with garter snakes. Garter snakes can sometimes be a little bit tricky to identify. There's actually different species of garter snakes that we have, and you can actually look at like where the lateral stripe is on what scale row to really help identify them. But the common garter snake is found throughout Indiana. You have 3 stripes. The lateral stripe on them is covering the 2nd and 3rd scale rows, and you count that from the belly up. So you have those. If you think about the belly, I know you probably don't think about this, the belly scales are very distinct, right? But then on the side of that, you start those smaller side scales, and those are all organized in rows. You can count those, and that's how you really identify some of these species. All right. Sorry, I skipped a scale. All right. Oh, wow. Okay, so this is actually a timber rattlesnake up in the air. I didn't kind of have that. So one of the things about that study I mentioned, I thought this slide was somewhere else. That's why it confused me. Is that we looked at survival of these rattlesnakes, and so what we found was that female survival was really strongly related to mass failure. So in other words, if you had a poor acorn crop in a year, the following year to that, you actually had lower female survival. And the thought is that it really affected small mammal populations because they were doing small mammal studies concurrently. And so bad acorn crop, small mammal population decline, and as a result, that was their primary food source. And so you had declines of lower survival of rattlesnakes. So kind of neat. And so this behavior is observed frequently following a poor mast year. And so the thought there is that they're out there foraging for different food, things like, songbirds and things like that. So again, most snakes, you might hear the term that they lay eggs or they have live young. Obviously, all their young is live, but rattlesnakes bear the little young. They don't bear the eggs. And they'll have 12 to 13, 14 young in a particular clutch. So they look quite different than the adults, but in terms of color, but again, same color, markings and things like that from that standpoint. So I want to close here on some management. So with amphibians, obviously one of the things with forest that we talk about is timber harvesting, because that's probably the most impactful or visually dramatic thing we can do from a management standpoint. Maybe fire would be too, to some extent, but certainly amphibians. And so amphibians like moist habitats. And so if you start creating openings like this, that's not great for these amphibians in the short term. But like in terms of the research done on the He, what they found was that they most likely move out of these areas into adjacent kind of forest matrix from that standpoint. But if you do any harvesting like this, having a lot of down woody debris as cover seems to be really important compared, in terms of some of these studies that have been done. Certainly small scale studies or small scale harvest, single tree harvest, things like that are really not going to impact these species at all. The biggest thing about amphibians is really that water. So the water source is key for a lot of these, not all of them like we talked about, but certainly for a lot of them. So the thought there is if you have a wetland in the forest matrix, that you really want to limit harvesting in and around those, right? And so within 100 feet, 75% or more canopy cover you want to retain, and within 400 feet, 55%. So if you think about it, these wetlands are really, really important for breeding, which is key to maintaining populations, but they don't spend their whole time in there, right? So they're moving in the forest matrix. And so you have to have good forest around them. And so that's the reasoning behind that. And again, the vernal pools, sometimes in publications or websites, sometimes they call them ephemeral pools, vernal pools, breeding pools. It just depends on the terminology. It's really all the same thing. Some years they have water and some years they don't, which is perfectly fine because that really keeps them fishless, which is key. Most of the species of salamanders, frogs, and toads that we have can't cohabitate with fish. The predation pressure is too much and they can't do it. But all the leaf litter, all the sticks and all that kind of stuff in there is substrate for egg masses. It's nutrients for things that they eat. And so these things are really, really, really key. You go in southern Indiana, a lot of times you'll find these natural or constructed pools on ridge tops, right? And so a lot of these species aren't really in streamland, bottomland areas. If you go in the northern areas or flatwoods, certainly you'll have wetlands and things like that they'll utilize that from that standpoint. You can actually construct these, right? So there's actually a couple resources that you can do. This individual, Thomas Biebighauser, he used to work at the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. And so he's kind of the guru when it comes to wetland construction, vernal pond construction. But there are some skills involved in terms of that, avoiding natural wetlands, how you do them. He's got a guide out there, has really, really good information. But for most people, you probably want to get professional help. And so NRCS has some expertise in this from that standpoint. So for those of you who work with NRCS, maybe you're doing some equip kind of projects, things like that, reach out to them and see if that's something that could be done on your property as well. In terms of reptiles, openings probably are, I would say, are not detrimental or even much, much more beneficial, right? And so if you think about it, reptiles, they have to bask in the sun to maintain body temperature. They want to be warm. That helps them digest their food. And so actually there's been studies that show that the more, if you open up the canopy, that actually benefits these species. You get more individuals and you get more species. And so having large openings like this with down woody debris, that's really habitat for them. Even something like box turtles, what we found on that study is box turtles would go in and out of the edges of these things. Presumably they're seeking, it's temperature based or it's food based because you get a lot of insects, fruits, and things like that in these areas that you don't get within the forest matrix itself. Sometimes we think of forests as, big trees, closed canopy, that kind of stuff. Open forests for reptiles are really, really great. So you get a lot of reptiles that something like this, that's almost like a glade or a savanna kind of a situation, they do perfectly fine with that. Again, there's plenty of areas where if they need to cool off, they can cool off. Again, having that structure there, that down woody debris can benefit from that. But certainly areas where they can hunt and bask and things like that are important. Down woody debris with all of these species, woodland amphibians, salamanders, and a lot of our snakes. Certainly down woody debris are really, really critical. I mentioned the tree chops and some of that brushy stuff that seems to be important for box turtles, so that's another thing. But again, you almost can't have enough of this kind of habitat within your woodlands. Even the stuff that we do from a timber harvesting standpoint. So maybe you're doing firewood cutting, you're doing timber harvesting, all those kinds of things. Creating openings with structure like this, these are really beneficial areas in terms of reproduction. A lot of times, and some of these log landings, if you flip over small logs or pieces of wood, rocks, that kind of stuff, you'll find actually eggs of different species deposited there. So kind of neat from that standpoint. And then the last plug I'll make for reptiles is water. Okay, reptiles use drinking water. They drink water, and so it's important. But it's also important from a thermal regulation standpoint. And so one of the years we did the box turtle study down at the He, it was a drought year. So I think that was 2012, I want to say. And so in that 1 year, some of these turtles exhibited really bizarre behavior. They'd travel a mile or two to find water, and they'd spend 1 week to even more than a month just kind of hanging out on the periphery of the water, embedded in this mud like it's just hanging out. And it was probably partly thermal regulation, but partly also being able to drink water. And a lot of these woodlands, you know, you'll have little ephemeral streams and things like that. So there's always areas that they can get water from. Certainly like dew, morning dew and things like that. A lot of animals will consume that, and that's how they get their water. But when it's really, really dry for a really, really long time, those sources are gone. And so having permanent water can really benefit some of these species. All right, so my screen is blank, so that must be my time's about up. And if there's time, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you have from that standpoint.
Hey, thanks, Brian. That was very interesting. And those pictures were amazing to see. It's not often, I'm not one that notices things very much in the woods. It's not often I get to see things in such clear and close detail. We had a question about how big the lizard eggs get. You had a picture of a female lizard with some eggs in and then someone else pointed out the eggs look very big in comparison to that lizard.
Yeah. So what happened? They don't lay them all at once, right? So if you think about it, so the amphibians, like the salamanders and the frogs and toads, they kind of lay them all at once, and then they swell from the water, right? So think about like a lizards. If you think about it, reptiles are really closely related to birds. And so a chicken just lays one, although occasionally two. I used to have chickens, right? Eggs in a day. And so they're there day after day laying those eggs. And so that's why that is. That's a really good question.
And someone asked, aren't the Massasauga snakes pretty uncommon?
Very uncommon. Yep. In fact, most of the time, the only time you're going to find them is really in most of our snakes start hibernation like sometimes in September, sometimes not until November. And so Massasaugas tend to be a later hibernating species. And what happens though, when you get to that point, is the nights get cold. And so you really, really want to warm yourself up. And so you'll see them on roads and things sometimes, like into October, mid-October, up in those habitats. And so that's usually when people observe them.
Someone mentioned the snakes in the trees reminded them of Costa Rica.
Well, I've never been to Costa Rica, but let me tell you, the first time I was tracking this rattlesnake, I couldn't find it, right? And sometimes that makes you a little nervous because the equipment that you use, you kind of know when you're getting close. You don't know exactly how far, but you kind of get a feel for if you're on a certain setting, the strength of the signal. You kind of know generally, okay, I'm within 5, 6, 7 feet of the snake. And
you've got a tracker on them.
Yeah, absolutely. They're implanted within them. And so, so the first time that happens, you're looking a long time and you're going slowly. But yeah, the one picture I had was a technician of mine. She took that picture. That snake was probably about 25 to 30 feet in the air. And that snake probably spent almost a week in that tree.
Wow.
Yeah.
Tom asked, what was CWD reference on the vernal pool slide?
Sorry. We always use acronyms. That's coarse woody debris.
Coarse
Down
woody
wood
debris.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yep. Sorry about that.
You referred to the down woody debris several times, and just to clarify, that's branches, tree tops, and logs, rotting logs that are on the ground.
Yeah, like the technical definition of coarse woody debris is like a certain diameter, that kind of stuff. And so treetops sometimes really don't fall within that. But the treetops, you know, for whatever reason, when we're tracking those box turtles, a lot of times when they were down, just kind of hanging out, oftentimes it was under like just kind of that brushy treetop cover, right? And so, you know, they're not going to bury themselves under a big log, but something that provides that overhead, you know, you kind of think of like a small treetop, you know, that kind of a thing would definitely kind of provide them some cover.
Well, we are out of time and questions, but I do have one last one for you.
Sure.
There's been quite a bit of news lately in Indiana about the loss of wetlands and some legislative bills to consider removing some protections for wetlands. What are you seeing in terms of the change in this wildlife and how it's responding to the loss of wetlands we've had already, and what's it look like for the future? Sorry,
wow. Okay.
I didn't give you any warning on that.
You know, when you look, you know, historically, most of Indiana's wetlands are right now are forested wetlands, and so Indiana is really high up on the list in terms of the proportion of wetlands we lost from historical, right? And so wetlands obviously provide wildlife a lot of values. They have other values in terms of, restoring groundwater and water flood retention and all those kinds of things. So they're very valuable, right? One thing I think is pretty clear about wetlands is if you build it, you'll get an immediate response. And so I think when you look at the wetland reserve program that created, oh gosh, I'm having an old senior moment here. What's the big wetland there in Greene County, the wildlife area
Goose
down there?
Pond.
Goose Pond, thank you. Yeah, what is that like? It's one of the largest WRPs in the country, if I'm not mistaken, if not the largest. But they had an immediate response of a lot of different birds that really weren't sighted in Indiana until those. They created some habitat for crawfish frogs. On Hoosier National Forest, they did a project where they built a lot of vernal ponds on the forest. And when I mean a lot, I'm talking maybe 70, 80, at least the last time I checked in, and they had an immediate response of different frogs and salamanders and things like that. Utilize that. So certainly these things are important. I'm not one to say I know the reason why, the importance of all these different species. Certainly, I think we can all agree that having a functioning ecosystem is important and provides us some kind of a benefit, although the exact benefit isn't always clear. And so wetlands are certainly an important part of that picture. So anything we can do to kind of promote wetland conservation and reward people who do things on their property to establish those, I would definitely support.
And Brian gave me a number of resources on ID and other information about all of these creatures, and I'll share those with you via email tomorrow. And I'll also share that Creating Vernal Ponds publication, which is a great one. I have one final question for you, Brian. Chris wanted to know, did the HE project find much difference between silviculture and harvest methods and herp response? And are those studies still being conducted at the HE with herps?
So the salamander stuff is going on. So with that project, you had different species or communities that are sampled on a regular basis. So songbirds was one that's regular. Terrestrial salamanders is another one. And so with the terrestrial salamanders, and so Jamie MacNeil was the student that did some of the early work on that, looking at early responses. And so what she found was that a lot of the responses that you saw was related to weather and particularly rainfall. And so depending on how the rainfall was during that year, you'd get very dramatic results. The other thing is that you'd get different results from different species. And so in other words, sometimes we think of like, oh, well, all these terrestrial salamanders are the same. That's not what she found. So she found that slimy salamanders, I think, had less of a response to harvesting than some of the other ones. So the jury on that is still out, right? Because you're looking at long term. Sometimes with some of these studies is that you look at, well, it had an effect during a couple of years, so that's bad. So you don't want to do that. But you got to look at the whole big system, right? And so the whole forested system. If you think about it, most of our state forests and state parks are those properties because they were cleared at one point, cleared of trees. They were grazed, farmed, all that kind of stuff. And then it wasn't very productive. So the state got them back and they just let the stuff grow up. And you still have those animals there now today, right? So, change isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you're looking at it. You got to look at it from a bigger picture, from a longer term picture. And unfortunately, like in the news cycle, sometimes those things get mixed up. With the box turtles, we found that some of the animals did change their behavior. But the thing is, when you look at survival wasn't impacted, right? So that had nothing to do with harvesting. And so just because, the analogy I always give people is, we all have routes that we go to work or school or church or whatever. And if there's a detour because of construction, we change that, right? So you think, oh my God, that's bad. We're changing our behavior. Well, it's more of a nuisance than any effect on survival or ability to function, right? And so sometimes that really applies, I think, in nature, and sometimes that gets lost.
Thank you. Well, it was great to have this presentation tonight, and we do appreciate all of you who joined us today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will follow up with you soon with more information from Brian.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Brian.
Yep, you bet. Good night.